By early 2026, the confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran evolved beyond a localized military exchange. It shifted into a campaign of systemic economic coercion, targeting the industrial infrastructure that underpins the global order. The International Energy Agency assessed this conflict as the greatest energy threat in modern history. The IEA is a global intergovernmental organization that provides data and policy recommendations on energy security. By their metrics, the current disruption has already surpassed the 1970s oil crises and the 2022 European gas shock in sheer volume. This crisis reveals a poor paradox. Overwhelming Western naval superiority and strategic basing at nodes like Diego Garcia have failed to stabilize global markets. Military mass alone cannot suppress the economic ripples of modern warfare. The danger is defined by the transmission mechanism of risk, how physical combat at a geographic choke point converts into a cascade of volatility across every major macroeconomic indicator. To trace this deterministic cascade, we can look at the Indian economy. With its extreme reliance on imported commodities, India serves as the primary stress test subject for measuring how a shock in the Gulf forces adaptations thousands of miles away. Geopolitical warfare now targets the connective tissue of the global economy. When the infrastructure of global trade becomes a primary target, the concept of a strictly localized conflict is entirely obsolete. The Strait of Hormuz is the source of this contagion. Its navigable shipping corridor is constrained to a 6-mile-wide channel. This geography provides an asymmetric advantage. Hidden coves and steep rock faces conceal fast attack boats and drone batteries, keeping them invisible until engagement. This compressed terrain mathematically neutralizes the advantages of deep-water naval escorts. The proximity of potential threats reduces defensive reaction times to seconds, making it nearly impossible for warships to guarantee the safety of the tankers they accompany. Shipping lines and insurers reprice the route based on this geographic vulnerability. Commercial confidence erodes based on the terrain itself, regardless of how many warships are present. In response, major logistics firms like Maersk have halted shipments through the Gulf, implementing drastic emergency freight rate increases immediately to account for the risk and the cost of rerouting. Rerouting forces this massive traffic toward alternative choke points like the Panama Canal. This creates a secondary strain on global infrastructure, as arteries already at capacity are forced to absorb the diverted volume of the Gulf. Geography functions as Iran's most durable coercive weapon. Tehran has successfully transformed the threat of maritime ambush into a permanent tax on global trade. The disruption travels directly from the strait to the energy import terminals of Asia. LNG, or liquefied natural gas, is the primary fuel for industrial power and chemical manufacturing. India's baseline vulnerability is acute. The country must import roughly 88% of its total crude oil requirements to maintain its current growth trajectory. Energy functions as the foundational industrial feedstock for secondary markets, dictating the production capacity of the manufactured goods that sustain the domestic economy. And this creates the agricultural feedstock squeeze. It is the process by which a maritime energy crisis instantly converts into a domestic agricultural crisis through the rising cost of chemical inputs. India's soil nutrient security is heavily dependent on imports. The country sources 22% of its urea, 52% of its DAP, and 100% of its potash from international suppliers. DAP, or diammonium phosphate, is a critical source of nitrogen and phosphorus for crops. The economic dependency is absolute. Natural gas accounts for 70 to 80% of the total production cost of urea, making fertilizer prices a direct function of LNG availability. As Gulf LNG traffic drops, domestic Indian fertilizer plants are forced to operate below capacity. If the disruption persists, these massive industrial hubs may be forced to idle entirely. Agricultural dealers are already hoarding existing stock and pivoting to specialty micronutrients. They are attempting to hedge their inventories against the impending volatility in conventional fertilizers. This happens as the Kharif sowing season approaches. The Kharif season is the primary autumn harvest window in India that relies on nutrient application during the summer monsoon. Missed windows during this period permanently depress total crop yields. The energy shock in the Strait of Hormuz mathematically guarantees a food security crisis in South Asia within a single crop cycle. The cascade also hits the human capital embedded in the conflict zone. Nearly 10 million Indian expatriates work across the Gulf, providing the labor that drives regional infrastructure and service sectors. As combatants target regional economic centers and aviation infrastructure, these labor communities face direct physical risks. This forced the launch of Operation Sindhu. Operation Sindhu is a massive, coordinated state extraction mission designed to evacuate citizens from an active theater of war. The logistical execution required extracting thousands of citizens from nodes in Israel and Iran, with flights from cities like Mashhad and Tel Aviv delivering evacuees back to New Delhi. These conflicts force governments to divert immense fiscal and logistical resources away from long-term economic development and into emergency civilian extraction. While the citizens are physically evacuated, their capital flees digitally back to India. In March 2026, data showed an anomalous 20 to 30% surge in remittance inflows to India. Remittances are the funds sent by expatriate workers back to their home countries. This is the remittance paradox. While a sudden cash influx usually signals economic health, here it indicates systemic panic. This capital surge is driven by geopolitical anxiety. Migrant workers are liquidating assets and sending transfers home before regional job security collapses. But the risk here is entirely structural. The freezing of construction, tourism, and retail in the Gulf portends systemic layoffs for the very migrant labor that sustains the remittance economy. These funds function as macroeconomic shock absorbers for India, essential capital inflows that help finance trade gaps and sustain domestic household consumption. While these panic transfers temporarily bolster foreign exchange reserves, they act as a lagging indicator of a devastating collapse in regional labor markets. Surviving this cascade of volatility requires supply chain dexterity. India has navigated the crisis by refusing to lock into rigid military blocks. This strategy is known as calibrated multi-alignment. It is a diplomatic doctrine that prioritizes functional, issue-based partnerships with rival actors to preserve strategic autonomy. India negotiated a humanitarian window to secure discounted Iranian LPG shipments, specifically to avert its domestic fertilizer shortage. LPG, or liquefied petroleum gas, is a fuel feedstock essential for both industrial processing and household energy. Simultaneously, India deepened ties with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, securing $10 billion in green hydrogen investments, even as it continued to trade with their regional rival, Iran. Maintaining alternative physical routes is equally critical. The continued development of the Chabahar port allows India to access Central Asian markets through a route that bypasses traditional regional blockades. In an era of polarized warfare, extreme supply chain dexterity, not military alignment, is the ultimate hedge against economic ruin. The completed system dynamics map reveals the full causal chain. The topography of Hormuz drives shipping rates, which dictates fuel supply, which determines fertilizer costs, eventually impacting food security, labor evacuations, and remittance flows. Policy interventions like strategic petroleum reserves and multi-aligned diplomacy act as circuit breakers. They divert the pressure of the shock away from critical failure points in the domestic economy, but the effects remain global. This imported inflation has forced the European Central Bank to freeze planned interest rate cuts. The ECB is the central bank of the European Union member states that have adopted the euro, and its decisions set the cost of capital worldwide. Geopolitical risk must now be permanently priced into the global cost of capital and trade routing. The friction of the 2026 conflict is not a temporary spike, it is a structural change. Treating regional kinetic conflicts as temporary anomalies is a failure of analysis. Cascading macroeconomic volatility is the new,